The Sahel is silent, but don't be fooled. In the stillness, there is a storm brewing, one not of thunder, but of empires shifting, of a region that has long been told to submit, now beginning to rise. The world thought the empire had left, but what if silence is not peace? What if silence is just the pressure before the storm? What if it's the sound of belief shifting from the hands of foreign powers into the hearts of the Sahel's people? For generations, the people of the Sahel have been caught in a battle not of their making, a battle fought under the banners of freedom, security, and cooperation. Yet beneath the surface, those banners have often masked the weight of control. And now, in the quiet deserts, that control is being questioned. As foreign powers step back, their influence remains in disguise, and the Sahel is learning to stand without permission. But this is not a story of surrender. This is a story of reclaiming what's always been theirs. It's the story of one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and the growing defiance that's reshaping the future of Africa. If you believe in Africa's right to shape its destiny, don't forget to hit subscribe. Join us as we explore how the Sahel's fight for freedom is changing the world. In 2023, the world watched as France announced its withdrawal from the Sahel. For many, this was a moment of triumph, a signal that an era of foreign dominance was coming to an end. French convoys rolled out of the region, and the media hailed it as the closing of a chapter. Analysts in Paris called it a strategic withdrawal. But in the dusty streets of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, something else was being whispered. They are not leaving. They are repositioning. These words, spoken by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, echoed like a thunderclap. His calm, deliberate tone gave no room for doubt. Traoré, the rising voice of a new Africa, had seen this before. He knew the language of geopolitics well enough to recognize that while France may have withdrawn its troops, its grip on the region had not loosened. The map of the Sahel was changing, but not in the way the world had been led to believe. Despite the French government's assurances, reports began surfacing that their influence in the region was far from over. A few weeks after the final withdrawal, new dots began to appear on regional maps. Small red circles scattered across remote areas of Benin, Ivory Coast, Senegal, places far from the headlines, yet deeply intertwined with the Sahel's heartbeat. Each of these circles marked new military installations, new training hubs, new cooperation centers. The name of the game had changed, but the players were the same. The French military, once so visible in the region, had quietly transformed. No longer were they marching under flags of colonialism. Now, they marched under the guise of partnership. Their military presence had become less about boots on the ground and more about the quiet, persistent hum of drones flying overhead. They no longer wore the uniforms of old colonial armies. Instead, they wore the uniforms of trainers, advisors, and partners. But the mission remained unchanged. Traoré understood the implications of these changes better than anyone. In a region where history is written in the blood of its people, he knew that the stakes were high. This wasn't just about military presence. It was about the preservation of a long-standing system of control. The French withdrawal, which had been celebrated in Western media, was nothing more than a strategic repositioning of power. France had learned to adapt, to evolve. Where once the empire relied on physical occupation, it now relied on something more subtle, something more insidious. In the quiet corners of the Sahel, the locals were beginning to see the truth. They saw the French drones circling not above militant hideouts, but over their farms and trade routes. They saw the new French bases being built under different names, with shiny modern labels like stabilization centers and humanitarian hubs, and they knew that the language of cooperation was nothing more than a veil over the same old chains. The Sahel had been here before. The promises of freedom and independence had been whispered for decades, only to be broken when the time came to act. The French had promised to leave, but in reality, they had merely repackaged their presence for a new generation. The Sahel was beginning to realize that true freedom didn't come from speeches or declarations. It came from breaking the chains that bound them. As France continued to spin its narrative of cooperation, the people of the Sahel, led by figures like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, began to rewrite their own story. They were no longer passive recipients of foreign promises. They were active participants in shaping their future. And the world would soon learn that when the Sahel decided to stand, it would not be merely a symbol of resistance. It would be the beginning of a new chapter in Africa's fight for sovereignty. As the dust from France's so-called withdrawal began to settle, the Sahel was left with an unsettling realization. The French may have left their bases behind, but their influence had not disappeared. Instead, it had evolved, morphing into something more elusive, more insidious. In the months following the French retreat, the French government remained steadfast in its message of cooperation. The military withdrawal was hailed as a victory for the Sahel, a victory for sovereignty, and a victory for the forces of independence. But for those who were paying attention, the picture was much murkier. French drones continued to circle the skies, not over militant hideouts, but over trade routes, villages, and fields. French advisors remained, now tasked with training the very military forces they once controlled. French military bases in places like Benin, Ivory Coast, and Senegal were rebranded under the guise of stability centers and security hubs. The labels had changed, but the strategy remained the same. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was the moment of truth. In a closed-door meeting with his officers, he spoke with calm authority, his words cutting through the room like a knife. They are not leaving. They are repositioning. The game is the same, only the name has changed. His words were not met with applause but with quiet understanding. Traoré, the young officer hailed as the voice of a new, independent Africa, understood the stakes of this moment better than anyone. His voice resonated with the experiences of generations who had fought against foreign control, against colonialism, and against the forces that sought to keep Africa in chains. He saw clearly what the West failed to understand, that real freedom wasn't about leaving or staying. It was about control, influence, and sovereignty. The local population, too, saw through the narrative. The illusion of French withdrawal began to unravel as the new French partnerships took root. The French drones flying under joint EU command were still present, just as they had been before. But now they were not labeled as tools of war. Instead, they were framed as part of a larger effort for regional stability. The locals, however, were not fooled. They saw the drones hovering not over militant zones, but over trade routes, farmlands, and villages. One local farmer in Mali spoke bitterly into his microphone. "They say they protect us, but they watch us more than they help." In the markets, whispers grew louder. Cooperation had become synonymous with something else, something far more sinister. The people were no longer content to sit quietly and accept these foreign interventions, disguised as assistance. The region, and especially Traoré, was beginning to wake up to the reality that the cooperation promised by France was not about partnership, it was about control. Even as Paris continued to push its narrative of mutual benefit, Traore and his allies began to speak openly about the true nature of these so-called partnerships. In an address to the nation, Traore stood firm, his voice unwavering. "We do not seek war," he declared. "We seek balance. But if the choice is between submission and struggle, the Sahel will choose struggle." His words reverberated through the Sahel like a thunderclap, sparking outrage in some quarters and admiration in others. But above all, they resonated deeply with the people of the region. For too long, the Sahel had been defined by foreign powers, by the West, by colonial powers, by those who sought to control the region's resources. But now, the Sahel was beginning to write its own story. Traoré's message was simple. The struggle was not against the French or the West. It was a struggle for the right to define the future of the Sahel on its own terms. And that, for many in the region, was a battle worth fighting. As the tension between the Sahel and its former colonial masters began to rise, the international community began to take notice. France, along with its European allies, started to ramp up its diplomatic efforts, claiming that their actions were about supporting regional security. But the people of the Sahel saw through these words. They saw it as a thinly veiled attempt to maintain control over the region's resources and political landscape. In Washington and Paris, government officials wrung their hands, anxious about the changing dynamics in the Sahel. Analysts predicted that the region would spiral into chaos, that the rise of nationalism would lead to instability, and that this new defiance would only lead to greater conflict. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that the Sahel was not headed toward chaos, it was heading toward independence. In villages across the Sahel, from Mali to Burkina Faso, people began to rally in support of Traoré's vision. Sovereignty or nothing, they chanted in the streets. Posters of Traoré began to appear next to the images of other African freedom fighters like Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba. For the people of the Sahel, Traoré was no longer just a military leader. He was a symbol of resistance, a symbol of the power of Africa to take control of its own future. As the French presence in the Sahel began to shift from overt military occupation to covert operations under the guise of partnership and cooperation, the consequences became evident. These changes were subtle at first. New bases in Benin, Ivory Coast, and Senegal, ostensibly for regional stability. New French drones and military equipment flying over the Sahel's borders, described as necessary for counterterrorism efforts. But beneath the surface, the people of the Sahel could see that nothing had truly changed. The imperial system had simply adapted, finding new ways to entrench itself. In villages across the Sahel, the atmosphere was tense. While the media in Europe and the West hailed the French withdrawal as a victory for African sovereignty, the reality on the ground was different. The local populations could feel the presence of the French in a new, more insidious form. The streets were filled with whispers that the drones hovering overhead were not for safety, but for surveillance. Whispers that the so-called training hubs and partnerships were simply disguised military operations aimed at maintaining control. The Sahel had long been the battlefield for foreign powers seeking to extract its resources that had fueled Western economies for centuries. But now, as the region began to take ownership of its own future, something new was happening. The people of the Sahel were beginning to reclaim their resources not just in name, but in action. In Mali, for instance, the government announced the nationalization of several foreign mining concessions. This was a bold move, one that sent shockwaves through international markets. The Western world reacted with disbelief and concern. French investors in the region feared the economic consequences. The European Union expressed its concern over the instability this would bring. But for the people of Mali, it was an act of justice, long overdue. In a remote mining town north of Ouagadougou, a foreman named Idrissa stood beside a pit that his father had once labored in for a French company. The sign at the gate had changed. No longer did it say Soyet International, now it read Men Duple. Idrissa looked at the dust swirling under the sun and smiled. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of ownership. What they were digging now belonged to them, not to foreign companies that had profited off their land for decades. The sense of ownership was spreading, not just in the mines, but in every corner of the Sahel. From agriculture to trade, the people were beginning to build their own futures. And this, more than anything, was the true consequence of the Sahel's fight for sovereignty. A region no longer dependent on foreign powers for its survival. But the West wasn't ready to let go. As the Sahel began to flex its newfound economic muscles, international financial institutions began to respond. Credit ratings were revised, and Western governments began freezing development loans. The pressure was mounting. Western commentators framed these moves as reckless and short-sighted. African leaders were being warned that they were isolating themselves from the global economy. But the people of the Sahel saw things differently. They had learned a crucial lesson. You can't sanction belief. For them, this wasn't about economic survival. It was about sovereignty. They had spent decades living under the shadow of foreign influence, watching as their resources were extracted without their benefit. Now they were saying no. They were saying, we will define our future, even if it means sacrificing short-term gains for long-term independence. In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the streets were filled with young engineers working late into the night to assemble the first locally built solar grids. In Bamako, mechanics were refurbishing old military trucks, turning them into transport fleets that would help facilitate trade across the region. In Nami, women's cooperatives were weaving textiles, no longer reliant on European imports, but using locally sourced materials. The people of the Sahel were learning to live without permission, and they were doing it with pride. Yet despite this growing sense of self-reliance, the pressure from the West was relentless. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the freezing of foreign aid programs were just the beginning. The West was hoping that by cutting off the Sahel's access to international capital, it could force the region back into submission. But the Sahel had learned something far more valuable than any economic model or financial system. It had learned that true independence was not about wealth. It was about power, dignity, and the right to choose its own path. As the economic pressure mounted, the Sahel began to grow stronger. The revolution was not just about defying foreign powers. It was about creating something new, something that did not depend on the whims of international financial institutions or foreign governments. The Sahel was building its own future, and the West was watching, powerless to stop it. The economic strangulation by the West may be a slow and silent process, but one question remains. Will the Sahel succumb to these pressures, or will it continue to rise, building its future from the ground up? The story of the Sahel's resistance reverberated far beyond its borders. As the region asserted its sovereignty and reclaimed control over its resources, the world began to watch in disbelief. For the Western powers, France, the United States, and the European Union, this wasn't just about a region trying to assert its independence. It was a challenge to the very idea of global order. a challenge that threatened the systems of influence and control they had maintained for centuries. In the halls of power in Washington, there was a palpable unease. The United States, while publicly supportive of the Sahel's right to self-determination, had its own concerns. The Sahel's move toward autonomy was viewed as a potential domino that could inspire other African nations to follow suit. The idea of a continent rising to reject the influence of the West was a nightmare scenario for Washington. As one analyst put it, if the Sahel succeeds, who's next? The language used in the U.S. State Department briefings reflected this anxiety. On the surface, officials spoke of the Sahel's right to sovereignty, but just beneath the surface, there was a distinct tone of caution. Diplomatic cables began circulating that warned of the malign influences from non-traditional partners, namely Russia and China, who had been making inroads in the region. For the United States, these new partnerships were seen as a threat not just to their political interests, but to the economic order they had helped create. The European Union, too, was caught between a rock and a hard place. The EU had long maintained a presence in Africa, under the guise of humanitarian aid and regional stability. But as the Sahel increasingly rejected European intervention, it was clear that the old ways were no longer working. French diplomats worked tirelessly to frame the growing independence of the Sahel as a threat to regional stability. But these attempts were met with increased skepticism in the international community. The real threat, it seemed, wasn't instability, it was the idea of an Africa that was capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Despite the mounting pressure from the West, the Sahel remained undeterred. Far from retreating into chaos, the region was finding new partners that didn't come with strings attached. China's involvement in the construction of infrastructure and the development of new trade routes was viewed with suspicion in the West. But to the Sahel, it was a welcome alternative to the old Western financial systems that had kept them dependent for so long. Russia, too, was making strides in the region, not through overt military intervention, but by offering military training and assistance, positioning itself as a new ally for African sovereignty. This shift in allegiances caused significant unease in Washington and Brussels. The Sahel was no longer relying on traditional Western alliances. Instead, it was forging a path that didn't need permission from the West to succeed. In Washington, there was a growing concern about the economic implications of this shift. What if other African nations, inspired by the Sahel's resistance, began to chart their own course, free from Western influence? The fear was palpable, and it was clear that the Western powers would do whatever they could to contain this growing movement of independence. Yet, the Sahel's move toward self-determination wasn't just about defying the West. It was about the right to define its own future. For the people of the Sahel, this wasn't about aligning with any particular global power. It was about rejecting the idea that their resources, their land, and their sovereignty were commodities to be traded on the global market. They were fighting not for alliances or support, but for the freedom to make their own choices. As the Sahel continues to carve out its own path, the world is left asking, will the Western powers accept this new reality? Or will they try to push the Sahel back into the old system of dependence and control? The Sahel is standing at the crossroads of its future, and while the region is far from free of challenges, there is a palpable sense of momentum. The political winds have shifted, and Africa's journey towards self-determination is gaining strength with each passing day. But the question remains, what comes next for the Sahel, and can it truly sustain this newfound independence in the face of growing external pressure? The Sahel's shift towards sovereignty is not just political, it is also economic, social, and cultural. As foreign powers continue to pull the strings of the global economic system, the people of the Sahel are learning that survival is not just about resisting foreign control. It's about creating their own systems, their own infrastructure, and their own future. The region is actively pursuing sustainable development through its own resources, its own ingenuity, and its own people. One of the most significant developments in the Sahel is the movement towards self-sufficiency. In the cities of Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey, young engineers are working day and night to build solar grids, harnessing the region's abundant sunlight to power homes, schools, and businesses. These solar projects, though still in their infancy, signal a future where the Sahel can stand on its own energy resources, free from the whims of foreign suppliers. Similarly, local businesses are beginning to thrive in new ways. In Burkina Faso, farmers who once relied on foreign imports are now turning to local crops and products to sustain their communities. Women's cooperatives in Mali are weaving textiles made from local fibers, once reliant on European imports. The industrial base is slowly shifting from foreign dependency to local innovation, and each new success story adds to the Sahel's confidence that its path toward independence is not just possible, but sustainable. However, the road ahead is fraught with obstacles. Economic sanctions from the West are likely to intensify, as will the diplomatic isolation. The international community, particularly the EU and the US, will continue to apply pressure, attempting to coerce the Sahel back into the fold of global capitalism as they know it. The Sahel will undoubtedly face economic challenges, especially as it begins to cut ties with foreign investments and institutions. But the people of the Sahel have shown an incredible resilience, not just in the face of political and military pressure, but in their ability to adapt and create. The recent success of nationalized industries and locally driven development projects is a testament to the fact that the Sahel is not only capable of standing on its own, but is now actively building a future based on its own vision of sovereignty. With the Sahel now creating its own systems of power, infrastructure, and economy, the question is no longer whether it can survive, but whether the world will be ready for a future where Africa is no longer a pawn in global geopolitics, but a leader in its own right. Will the Sahel's road to independence be paved with struggle, or will it become the beacon for a new era of African self-determination? As the sun sets over the Sahel, a quiet but powerful transformation is taking place. The region is no longer just a backdrop for foreign powers to exert their influence. It is becoming the stage for a new chapter in African history, one where sovereignty, dignity, and self-determination take center stage. The Sahel, once caught in the shadow of colonialism and foreign intervention, is now carving out its own destiny on its own terms. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words, "We do not hate the West. We simply refuse to kneel," have become the rallying cry for millions across the Sahel. His message is simple but powerful. Africa is no longer willing to accept the status quo. The people of the Sahel are rejecting the idea that their future can be dictated by foreign powers. They are standing up for their right to define their own narrative, to reclaim their resources, and to build a future that reflects their values, not the values imposed upon them by external forces. This movement is not just about rejecting foreign control. It is about creating something better. It is about building a Sahel that is self-sufficient, a Sahel that doesn't rely on handouts from Western governments or multinational corporations. The revolution taking place in the Sahel is about more than just politics. It is about economic independence, cultural pride, and the ability to shape the future without the shadow of foreign domination looming over it. But the road ahead is not without its challenges. The Sahel will face continued pressure from global powers who fear the precedent it is setting. Economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the freezing of foreign aid programs are all likely as the West attempts to reassert its influence over the region. But the Sahel has already proven that it is resilient. It has shown that it is capable of standing on its own, and that it will continue to rise no matter the obstacles in its path. As the world watches, one thing is certain: the Sahel is no longer the passive recipient of foreign intervention. It is the active architect of its own future. And in this quiet revolution, the message is clear. Africa will no longer ask for permission. It will stand tall as the world watches a new Africa rise. If you believe in the Sahel's right to define its future, stand with us. Share this video, leave a comment, and let's continue to raise our voices for the freedom and sovereignty of Africa. The revolution has only just begun. Will you be part of it?